Good morning, everyone, or good evening, depending on where you are. Welcome to this event of the Quantitative History Webinar series. So today we are very fortunate to have two distinguished scholars. Our speaker, Professor Oded Galor, and also our discussant, Professor Richard Wong from the University of Hong Kong. First, by way of introduction, Professor Galor is the founder of Unified Growth Theory. He has contributed to the understanding of the process of development of the entire course of human history and the role of deep-rooted factors in the transition from stagnation to growth and in the emergence of the vast inequality across the globe. He has also pioneered the exploration of the impact of evolutionary processes, population diversity, and inequality on the process of development over most of human existence. So he has redirected research in the field of economic growth to the exploration of the long shadow of history and to the role of biogeographical factors in comparative economic development. So he's the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Economic Growth and editor of the Journal of Population Economics, as well as co-editor of Macroeconomic Dynamics. So he's going to talk about the journey of humanity, the origin of wealth and inequality today for his talk. And then Professor Wong received his PhD from the University of Chicago in 1981. He has spent time again at the University of Chicago in 1985 and also at the Hoover Institution at Stanford in 1989. So he joined the Hong Kong U School of Business in September 1992. He had served in various roles, including as the Dean of the Faculty of Business and Economics between 2001 and 2004, and then again 2004 and 2007. And then he was the Provost of Hong Kong U between 2004 and 2010. And then again, he is the current provost of Hong Kong U since 2019. So without spending too much time here, let me stop here in terms of making this quick introduction about the speaker's background and the discussant's background. But before I turn it over to Professor Galor, let me also remind everyone, so the format for the webinar today is that the speaker will talk for 1 hour, followed by a 10 to 15-minute discussion by Professor Wong. And then after that, we'll open the floor to questions from the audience. So as a reminder, please type your questions and comments in the Q&A box. And then during the Q&A session, I will select a few questions and comments, and then Professor Galor will address them if you like. Okay, so here you go, Professor Galor.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm delighted to address this forum and to share with you the insights that I gathered over 3 decades of research, and I've summarized in my recent book, The Journey of Humanity, The Origins of Wealth and Inequality. Okay. So as I said, I would like to devote my lecture to my recent book, The Journey of Humanity, The Origins of Wealth and Inequality. This book is being released simultaneously in 30 countries and 30 different languages across the globe. And in particular, it just appeared in both complex Chinese and simplified Chinese in the past months. So the journey of humanity, to a large extent, explores the evolution of human societies since the emergence of Homo sapiens in Africa nearly 300,000 years ago. It is an attempt to decipher, if you wish, the forces that operated and governed the process of development over the entire course of human history, and in particular, to resolve two of the most fundamental mysteries that surrounds this journey. The first one is the mystery of growth, namely, what is the origin of the dramatic transformation in living standards that occurred in the past 2 centuries after hundreds of thousands of years of stagnation? If you wish, why is it the case that in the past 200 years, we see that income per capita in the world economy has increased 14-fold after near stagnation over hundreds of thousands of years? And the second mystery is the mystery of inequality, namely, what are the roots of the vast inequality in the wealth of nations? Why is it the case that some countries are so poor and others are so rich? And why is it the case that in the past 2 centuries, we see an enormous divergence in the wealth of nations and across countries and across regions? Now, over most of human existence, human life, to a large extent, is nasty, brutish, and short. In fact, human life is remarkably similar to that of other species on planet Earth. Humans are preoccupied by survival and reproduction. Living standards are very close to the subsistence, and there were minor differences in living conditions across time and across space. In fact, only a few centuries ago, 1/4 of newborn died before reaching their first birthday, and 1/2 of them did not reach their reproductive age. A large number of women perished during childbirth, and life expectancy fluctuated in a very narrow range of 25 to 40 and rarely exceeded 40. And perhaps more strikingly, an economic crisis over this time period did not lead into belt-tightening, but rather into mass starvation and ultimately extinction. But then, over the past 2 centuries, we see this dramatic metamorphosis that is occurring in the world economy. A dramatic transformation in living standards within and across societies. Income per capita in the world as a whole increases 14-fold. Life expectancy has more than doubled, and a great divergence took place in income per capita across countries and regions of the world. Now, to better understand this metamorphosis, consider for a moment residents of Jerusalem at the time of Jesus 2,000 years ago. And suppose that we whisk these individuals in a time machine from Roman ruled Jerusalem in the 1st century to Ottoman ruled Jerusalem in the 19th century. Namely, these individuals will be whisked in a time machine nearly 2,000 years forward. Despite this 2,000-year jump, these individuals will be able to adjust instantaneously to the new economic conditions, the new economic environment. Past knowledge would be largely applicable. Technological improvements would be merely incremental, and as a result of it will allow for instantaneous adaptation. Occupations would require very similar skills, and life expectancy would remain rather unchanged, and as a result of it, would not require any changes in the individual mindset. But now, take these individuals that are residing in Ottoman ruled Jerusalem 200 years ago at the beginning of the 19th century and move them in a time machine 200 years forward only. Despite this minor 200 years jump, these individuals will have a shocking experience, a devastating experience. Past knowledge would be largely obsolete. Modern technologies would appear as a witchcraft. Occupations would require very different and incomprehensible skills. And perhaps more strikingly, life expectancy would instantly double, and as a result of it, will require a future-oriented mindset, a mindset that permits education decisions, saving decisions, and life cycle decisions. So something very dramatic occurred in the past 200 years. The life of people who lived 300 years ago was very comparable to the ones that lived 5,000 years ago. But the life of those of us that are living today is very different than the life of those who lived here 200 years ago. Now, if you think about the evolution of human standards or living standards across human history, it is in fact in contrast to the conventional wisdom that is advanced in recent popular science books, that what we observe, in fact, is that living standard has not evolved gradually in the course of human history. What is evolving gradually in the course of human history is technological progress. Technological progress accelerates gradually over time. But nevertheless, technological progress is contributing to the explosion of the world population rather than to the changes in living standards. Living standards remain unchanged over most of human existence. And technological progress was converted predominantly into larger population rather than richer population. And the recent rise in living standards in the past 200 years, so even a shorter period of time, is reflecting what I will define as a phase transition, namely an abrupt transformation that is occurring once a certain tipping point has been reached. Now, in order to understand this metamorphosis better, let's focus for a moment on the evolution of income per capita in the world economy in the past 2,000 years. As you can see here, over most of human existence, and certainly from the time period between the year 1 and 1800, income per capita in all regions of the world is very close to the subsistence level. And then suddenly, very abruptly, we see this enormous eruption in income per capita across the globe. Income per capita, as I said earlier, has increased 14-fold in the past 200 years after near stagnation for 300,000 years earlier. In fact, if I would have removed the labels of the x-axis and the label of the y-axis from this diagram, and I would have shown this plot to a random scientist, I would assume that most people will view it as an output of a seismograph, detecting tectonic activities and detecting eruptions that are occurring on planet Earth. But in fact, these are not tectonic activities. This is the evolution of income per capita. Income per capita is fluctuating very close to the subsistence level for a long period of time, and then a massive eruption is occurring in the past 200 years. Now, interestingly enough, when this eruption is taking place, it is not occurring universally across the globe. Some regions of the world are taking off at the beginning of the 19th centuries and even earlier, other regions only very recently. And since this takeoff is associated on average with a 14-fold increase in income per capita in the world economy, a huge divergence is occurring in the world economy. Western European countries and their offshoots in the Americas are taking off first. Other regions of the world, such as Sub-Saharan Africa, are lagging behind, and as a result of it, an enormous divergence is taking place in the world economy. So if you think about these two mysteries, the mystery of growth and the mystery of inequality, it is quite apparent that the resolution of these mysteries required the identification of those forces that permitted the transition from stagnation to growth, first, and second, that are behind the differential timing of the transition across the globe, namely behind the fact that some societies, some regions of the world are taking off much earlier than others. But in addition, it will require the identification of the forces that ultimately brought about this differential timing of the transition across the globe, namely historical forces and prehistorical forces that ultimately govern this differential timing of the transition across the globe. And clearly, the resolution of these mysteries will provide us with a very important insight about the design of strategies that could mitigate inequality across the globe today. They will permit us to expedite the transition of developing countries into the frontier, and consequently will allow us to mitigate inequality in the world as a whole. Now, when you think about the evidence that I presented in front of you, it is quite apparent that much of the inequality, as we see it today across the globe, is originated first during the differential timing of the transition from stagnation to growth 200 years ago. And second, it is associated with those historical and prehistorical forces that led into this differential transition. And consequently, much of the inequality that we see across the globe today is rooted in forces that operated in the distant past. And consequently, if we would like to understand the process of development, if we would like to understand the mystery of growth, if we would like to resolve and to understand the mystery of inequality, we have to ask ourselves how humanity as a whole evolved in the course of human history and why this evolution was differential across the globe. And this takes us to the understanding that we have to have a better exploration of the journey of humanity since the emergence of Homo sapiens. Namely, we need to develop a unified theory of economic growth that will link inequality today to forces that operated in the distant past. So when you think about the process of development, one can identify three fundamental phases in this process. What I will define as the Malthusian epoch, the post-Malthusian regime, and the modern growth regime. Now, the Malthusian epoch originates with the emergence of an anatomically modern human in Africa nearly 300,000 years ago. And it spans 99.9% of human existence till the eve of industrialization in the context of the most advanced societies in the world. And this Malthusian epoch is characterized by fascinating dynamism. On the one hand, stagnation in living standards, but on the other hand, certain dynamism in the context of technology, in the context of population, and in the context of human adaptation. And it is this dynamism that ultimately permits humanity to escape from the Malthusian epoch into what I will define as the post-Malthusian regime, and ultimately in the aftermath of the demographic transition into the modern growth regime. So as I said, if we would like to understand the roots of inequality, we would like to understand inequality today, we will have to have a better understanding of the forces that operated in the distant past. And in particular, the forces that operated during the Malthusian epoch and ultimately permitted the world to take off differentially from stagnation to growth and to contribute greatly to the inequality as we see it across the globe today. So as I said, when you think about the Malthusian epoch, this is a time period of important dualism, stagnation along with dynamism. Stagnation in living standards. Income per capita fluctuated very close to the subsistence level. Life expectancy fluctuated within a very narrow range of 25 to 40 and rarely exceeded 40. But at the same time, as I said earlier, we see great dynamism. Dynamism in the context of technology, dynamism in the context of the size of the human population, and dynamism in the context of the adaptation of the human population to its geographical and technological environment. Now, importantly, at any point in time, this dynamism is quite slow. Technological progress at a certain point in time is minuscule. We see one stone tool that is replacing another stone tool over thousands of years. But nevertheless, over 300,000-year period, these small changes in technology are amounting to the movement from stone tool technologies 300,000 years ago to steam engine technology in the eve of industrialization. Second, population. Population of planet Earth is increasing gradually in the course of human history for reasons that will become apparent momentarily. The size of the human population in the eve of the agricultural revolution, 12,000 years ago, is about 2.5 million people. And then the size of the human population in the midst of industrialization is about 1 billion people, namely a 400-fold increase in the size of the human population despite the stagnation in living standards. And it is this dynamism, it is this Malthusian dynamism that ultimately triggered the transition from stagnation to growth. So as I said, in order to understand inequality today, given the fact that much of this inequality has to do with the differential timing of the transition across the globe 200 years ago, and given the fact that this differential timing of the transition is associated with deep-rooted factors that were formed hundreds of years ago, thousands of years ago, and even tens of thousands of years ago, we need to search deeper into the forces that operated during the Malthusian epoch and affected ultimately the inequality as we see it across the globe today. So there are three important forces that are operating in the Malthusian epoch. And the first one is the impact of technological progress. So in today's world, when technology is advancing, societies become more prosperous. But in the past, the process was quite different. When technology advanced, then income per capita increased initially, as we would expect. People had better plow, better seeds, better cultivation methods. They had greater output than otherwise. But this increase in output was not long-lasting. Why? Because this increase in output reduced mortality rate, increased fertility rate, and as a result of it, population growth increase, and resources per person reverted back to the previous equilibrium position. Namely, technological progress did not have a long-lasting effect on income per capita. It had a short-run effect, a positive effect, but ultimately population adjusted and brought income per capita back to the previous equilibrium position. And this is very important because it implies that during the Malthusian epoch, that, as I said earlier, lasted over 99.9% of human existence, technologically advanced societies or land-rich societies had higher population density rather than higher level of income per capita. There were very little variations in income per capita that were associated with differences in technologies. Societies that were more advanced technologically, like the Chinese society, had tremendously larger populations, tremendously larger population density, but not necessarily richer population. And evidence is striking with this respect. If you, for instance, regress population density in the Middle Ages, say in the year 1500, on land productivity, then not surprisingly, the more productive the land is, the higher is the level of population density. Positive association between land productivity and population density. This by itself is not surprising and is not a confirmation of the Malthusian hypothesis. The surprising element is that those societies that had greater land productivity were not richer at the similar level of income per capita. As I said, greater land productivity led into greater population density, but not into greater income per capita. And the same is true for technological progress. It took measures of technological progress in the Middle Ages, and you look at the relationship between population density and technological level in the Middle Ages, you will find that population density increases with the level of technology. Technology permits more resources that sustain more people, but not richer people again. Higher level of technology does not translate into higher income per capita. So this is one important link. Technological progress results in greater population density, but not richer population. The second important element that is operating during the Malthusian epoch is adaptation, predominantly cultural adaptation. So as I said before, the Malthusian pressure affected the size of the human population. But in addition, it affected the composition of the human population. In what sense? Traits, whether they're cultural or individuals, that were complementary to the technological environment, tautologically generated higher income. But during this time period, higher income was converted into higher reproductive success. And consequently, these traits became more and more prevalent in the population, namely traits that were beneficial for the technological environments, generated tautologically higher income, but then higher reproductive success, and therefore larger number of people that are carrying these traits. And this implies that human adaptation over the course of human history raised the prevalence of complementary traits to the growth process and ultimately reinforced the process of development and ultimately the takeoff from stagnation to growth. So when we think about the forces that operated during the Malthusian epoch, it is quite apparent that the size of the human population and the composition of the human population affected technological progress. More people implied more innovators and therefore more ideas and faster technological progress. Or alternatively, more people implied more demand for innovations and as a result of it, more technological progress. And the same is true for the composition of the human population. More adaptable population implies that technology would advance more rapidly than otherwise. But in turn, as we just argued, technological progress resulted in larger population and more adaptable population. So in the course of human history, we see these wheels of change reinforcing one another. The size of the human population affects technological progress, brings about faster technological progress. Faster technological progress supports more people, and this rotation of the wheels of change are intensifying in the course of human history. So technological progress inevitably in the course of human history accelerated, and ultimately it reached a critical threshold. A critical threshold beyond which the technological environment in which people operated changed so rapidly so as to necessitate investment in human capital, investment in education that will permit people to navigate this stormy technological environment, that will permit individuals to cope with the changing environment. So human capital became essential, as I said, but how do you form human capital? Parents can invest in the education of their children, but they need resources for it. These parents are very poor themselves. They cannot economize on their own consumption. So in order to invest in the education of their children, they must economize on the number of children. And consequently, what we see is that human capital formation over this time period is triggering the decline in fertility. It's causing the fertility decline and the reduction in the sizes of families. Why is it so important? Because this breaks the Malthusian link between technology and population. It is no longer the case that more resources are converted into more children. Now, in fact, the Malthusian equilibrium vanishes entirely, and the growth process is freed from the counterbalancing effect of population. And consequently, at this point in time, technological progress, human capital formation, and the decline in population growth, these three forces are all contributing to the movement into the sustained growth regime. So let me illustrate it in a very simple fashion. What you can see here are the three wheels of change: the size of the population, the composition of the population, and technological progress. Humanity starts in Africa. Homo sapiens starts in Africa 300,000 years ago. The population is rather modest, but it has a unique advantage over other species, which is the human brain. And the human brain allows this modest population to innovate. This innovation brings about technological progress, and technological progress permits more people to be sustained. There are more resources that permits more children to survive and more of them to be born. And consequently, technological progress is feeding back into the size of the human population. But again, more people implies more potential innovators. And as a result of it, further technological progress. Further technological progress is feeding back into the size of the human population. At the same time, the changes in technological progress is changing the composition of the human population and selecting individuals and cultural traits that are more complementary to the technological environment, and this by itself reinforces the growth process. So over this 300,000 year period, technological progress is starting to evolve more and more rapidly. This wheel is rotating faster and faster and faster. And the rotation of these wheels implies that the technological environment starts to change, and there is a growing importance of human capital, of education, in order to navigate this stormy environment. But nevertheless, despite this growing importance, the rate of technological progress does not justify yet investment in human capital. Till we reach a critical point, the point of phase transition, in which suddenly investment in human capital starts to take place, And this is what we observe, for instance, in England, massively in the course of the 19th century. And consequently, we see a dramatic decline in fertility in the post-1870 period in England. Namely, we see the demographic transition that frees the growth process from the counterbalancing effect of population, and the world is moving into the modern growth regime. Now, when you think about this phase transition, I think it's very important to keep in mind the analogy between this phase transition and a phase transition that we observe in nature, in the transition between water and gas. So when we warm water in a tea kettle, as the water becomes warmer and more warmer, and we reach a critical threshold of 100 degrees Celsius, we see the transition from water to gas. This is a phase transition. The same holds in the course of human history. Societies are in the agricultural stage of development. Technology is evolving more and more rapidly in the course of human history. But nevertheless, despite this evolution, no change is taking place because the changes in the environment does not justify the investment in human capital. But ultimately, a critical threshold is being reached, similar to 100 degrees Celsius in the context of the water, beyond which investment in human capital starts to take place, the demographic transition is set in motion, and the world is sailing into the modern growth regime. But very importantly, precisely as in the water-gas metaphor, not all water molecules are converted from water to gas at the same time. Some are moving into the gaseous states much earlier than others. This is partly dependent on their location in the tea kettle. And the same is true in the world economy. Not all societies are taking off from the agricultural stage of development to the modern growth regime at the same time. Some societies are taking off much earlier than others, depending in particular on their geographical locations, but of course on other factors as well. So importantly, when we think about the roots of global inequality across the globe, if we think about the inequality as we observe it today, the year 2022, it is very important to realize that inequality across nations was negligible at the beginning of the 19th century. And much of the divergence occurs in the past 200 years. And as a result of it, in order to understand the roots of inequality, we need to understand what happened around this time period that caused societies to drift apart, some to take off, and others to remain trapped in the Malthusian epoch. Now, so when we think about inequality, uneven development across the globe, it is very tempting to argue that this uneven development is simply a reflection of cross-country differences in human capital accumulation, education, physical capital accumulation, machines, and technological level. But this doesn't take us anywhere. The question is, if this is the case, why some societies fail to invest properly in physical and human capital? Why some societies fail to adopt advanced technologies? And this leads us to realize that, in fact, there are deeper factors that are partly historical, partly prehistorical, that are forming barriers in the process of accumulation and technological adoption. Namely, certain historical conditions that prevents or slow down the process of human capital accumulation, physical capital accumulation, and technological level. And this leads us into the understanding that much of the inequality that we see across the globe today can be traced to deep-rooted factors that operated in the distant past. Institutional factors, cultural characteristics, and the ultimate roots of them, namely geographical characteristics and societal characteristics. So when you read my book, and I urge you to read the book because the book is going well beyond everything that I'm expressing here, and it is written in a way that it can be read in 6 to 8 hours. It's written like a novel, not like a difficult economic book. It's jargon-free, and it's entirely accessible. So when you read the book, you will realize that the book is divided into 2 parts. In the first part, I march forward in time, starting in Africa 300,000 years ago, and I move to the present in order to resolve the mystery of growth. And in the second part, I march backward. I start with the inequality as we see it today, and I peel gradually different layers of influence so as to trace the origin of this inequality across the globe. And as I peel different layers of influence, I ultimately discover the roots of inequality as we see it at the moment. So I start with the layer of institutions, namely the fingerprints of institutions. So as you know, many argued that in the course of human history, we see the emergence of differential institutions across the globe. Some societies are adopting growth-enhancing, inclusive institutions, others growth-retarding, extractive institutions, and due to this differential adoption, we see divergence in economic performance across countries. But we should note that institutions, to a large extent, are not manna from heaven. They're not exogenous. To a large extent, institutions are reacting to the process of development. Yes, some institutions emerge at random critical junctures in human history. So there are instances in which, in fact, random events made institutions critical in the evolution of some societies across the planet. But these are the exceptions rather than the rule. So let me mention a few of these exceptions. So for instance, the Black Death decimated the European population quite dramatically. 40% of the European population was decimated by the Black Death, and consequently generated an incredible scarcity of labor and competition for labor between the landed aristocracy and those individuals that operate in the urban sector led ultimately into the grip of the landed aristocracy over the workers, brought about the decline in feudalism, and ultimately the emergence of property rights. And arguably, these were the seeds of an early industrialization in England. If this is indeed correct, this would imply that indeed a random event was behind why England took off first rather than France or Germany or other places in Western Europe. Another important critical juncture is the Glorious Revolution. And as you know, the Glorious Revolution is bringing about constitutional monarchy in England. Namely, in the course of the Glorious Revolution, Williams of Orange is defeating James II, and consequently the aspiration of James II to restore an absolute monarchy and to revert into Catholicism is being abolished. A new monarch is established. He is foreign to the English tradition, being from the Netherlands. Consequently, he relies on the parliament, and this generates a check on the ability of the monarch to operate. And this leads into constitutional monarchy and ultimately into potentially property rights that are leading into perhaps the Industrial Revolution in Britain. So again, this is another important critical juncture, and we can certainly think about counterfactual history in which Williams of Orange would be defeated by James II in the battlefield, and the history of England would have been different. So there are these instances. And perhaps the most striking example, that is relatively close to you geographically is the division of the Korean peninsula along the 38th parallel. As we know, this division led into a tremendous inequality between the southern part of South Korea and North Korea. South Korea is 24 times richer than the North Korea, and life expectancy in South Korea is about 11 years longer. And naturally, one can think about a counterfactual history in which North Korea would be a sphere of influence of the West, and South Korea would be a sphere of influence of communism, in which case we will see a reversal in this economic performance. So these are fascinating examples, and certainly institutions, and particularly economic institutions, are very critical for the understanding of the gap between North and South Korea. But more broadly, institutions mostly evolve gradually in the course of human history. They did not appear randomly, they did not appear as a manna from heaven. So for instance, the Neolithic Revolution, the agricultural revolution, increased population density, brought about the emergence of cities, states, nations, empires, and consequently the demand for institutions that will coordinate the actions of individuals, that will protect property rights, and will permit the establishment of public goods. Second, ecological diversity, geographical conditions, led into the feasibility of trade between different ecological zones, and consequently state formation so as to facilitate this trade. And consequently, this state formation led into the demand and the supply of institutions. So again, economic conditions that ultimately brought about institutional changes. Or if you think about the suitability of land for large plantations. So for instance, in Central America, we see the emergence of coffee plantations because of the suitability of the land for this type of crops. And this led inevitably into the concentration of land ownership in the hands of the very few. And these individuals ultimately generated political power that allowed them to influence the formation of institutions. And naturally, given their economic interests, this led into the formation of extractive institutions and, in some occasions, even slavery. Or if you think about the harsh disease environment that existed in sub-Saharan Africa, this led into low population density and delay in the adoption of centralized institutions. So broadly speaking, my argument is that institutions, to a large extent, are not the primitive forces behind inequality. They are themselves driven by certain geographical conditions that existed across the globe. Yes, there are some instances in which institutions appeared at critical junctures, but in most cases, they are a byproduct of the process of development. So this leads us into the next layer of influence, namely the role of culture. If you think about the cultural factor, again, we see the emergence of differential cultural traits across regions of the world. For instance, we see the emergence of growth-enhancing cultural traits, such as social capital in some regions of the world, and we see the emergence of growth-retarding cultural traits, such as family ties, in other regions of the world. And these differential cultural traits were invoked in order to explain, for instance, the divide between the southern part of Italy and the northern part of Italy. The fact that in southern Italy, income per capita is about 2/3 of that in the north. So naturally, cultural factors are important, and in some cases, they dominate the importance of institutions. In the sense that if we would like to understand the divide between the northern part of Italy and the southern part of Italy, institutions cannot be invoked because both parts of the peninsula are are ruled by the same institutions. But it is these differential cultural traits that are behind the scene. But again, cultural traits are not exogenous to a large extent. They are a byproduct of the process of development. They emerge due to certain economic conditions, geographic conditions, and etc. So again, as before in the case of institutions, there are rare instances of random growth-enhancing cultural mutations. And perhaps the best example is the emergence of mandatory literacy in Judaism in the 1st century CE. At the time, Jewish sages are simply deciding that they would like to have all boys by the age of 13 being educated and being able to recite the Bible in front of the community. It has no economic justification. It has no role in terms of occupations and prosperity in the future. It is simply designed for academic needs. So in this respect, it's a cultural mutation. But nevertheless, it persists over time because ultimately investment in education becomes very profitable. It becomes very profitable in the urban environment, and it becomes very profitable as a portable way of capital that can be carried with individuals over time. Another important example of cultural mutation is associated with the Protestant Reformation, that is emphasizing thrift and entrepreneurship. And many argued that, in fact, the Protestant Reformation is associated with the spirit of capitalism. But naturally, Luther did not think about the spirit of capitalism. He thought about his religious doctrine. This was a cultural mutation that ultimately became beneficial and persisted over time. So cultural mutations exist, but they're very, very rare. In most cases, culture evolved and adapted to the environment. So for instance, as the return to education increase in the process of development, we see that there is a persistence in predisposition towards children education, namely individuals that have the predisposition towards children education are generating an evolutionary advantage, and this trait is becoming more and more prevalent in the population. But if you think about the suitability of the land for the use of the plow, in those places where the land was suitable for the use of the plow, we see that the division of labor is generated along the gender line. In what sense? The plow is relatively heavy and requires upper body strength, and consequently it gives an evolutionary advantage in agricultural production to men over women, generates a gender division between men and women, and ultimately gender biases that persist to the present. So again, geography that affects cultural traits as we see them today. Or if you think about crop yield, places with high crop yield are places where farmers were induced by nature to be engaged in the process of planting and harvesting, and consequently with a future-oriented behavior. Namely, they planted today, they harvested 6 months later, and they stored the seeds for future years. And consequently, they were forced by nature to be engaged in a future-oriented behavior. In those places, we see the emergence of cultural traits, which is a future-oriented mindset. But in other places, say societies of fishermen, this engagement is no longer relevant, and consequently future-oriented mindset is not necessarily developing. So again, in the context of culture, as was the case in the context of institutions, it is quite apparent that deeper factors that operated in the distant past, geographical factors, are behind much of the changes in institutions, and much of the evolution of cultural traits in the course of human history. So this leads us into the shadow of geography, namely the role of soil quality, climate, the disease environment, or geographical isolation in the evolution of cultural and institutional characteristics. So this is an indirect impact of geography. So its impact on cultural and institutional characteristics. Now, geography can have a direct effect on latent productivity, human capital formation, trade and technological progress. In particular, elements that are associated with the disease environment are reducing land productivity, human capital formation, and elements that are associated with isolation are reducing trade and technological progress. So clearly, there is a direct element of geography, but this is not part of what I will define as the long shadow of history. This direct impact can be mitigated by the diffusion of medical technology, transportation technology, and the IT revolution. So when we think about the legacy of geography, we are drifted back in human history to the onset of the Neolithic Revolution 12,000 years ago. And during this time period, we see the transition of human societies from hunter-gatherer tribes to agricultural communities. In the course of this transition, we see the emergence of a non-food producing class that is associated with knowledge creation. A food surplus is created. This food surplus supports this knowledge elite that is associated with the development of science, technology, and written languages. Why is it so important? Because this knowledge creation is creating a technological head start. If you move into the Neolithic, 2,000 years earlier than another society, you had an incredible technological head start that allows you to dominate other societies later on in human history. And in fact, Jared Diamond, in his famous thesis, argued that the variation in the time of the Neolithic Revolution, the variation in the time of the agricultural revolution across the globe, are the origins of global inequality across the globe. But as I showed in some of my empirical research, there are conflicting evidence about the Diamond hypothesis. In fact, the Diamond hypothesis explains some of the variations in inequality in the pre-industrial world. But in fact, it has no impact whatsoever on present-day inequality. Namely, the Diamond hypothesis does not shed light on inequality across the globe today. It is very important for the understanding of uneven development in the Middle Ages. So naturally, if we would like to understand inequality today, this will not take us very far. So our analysis took us back 12,000 years into the eve of the Industrial Revolution, the eve of the Agricultural Revolution. And ultimately, if we want to understand the entire scope of inequality across the globe, one important force that is operating behind the scene is human diversity. And human diversity and the distribution of human diversity across the globe is associated with the migration of Homo sapiens from Africa 60 to 90,000 years ago. So during this migration process, the distribution of population diversity across the globe is affected significantly, and consequently, as I showed earlier, and as I will argue momentarily, it affects comparative economic development in a very significant fashion. So during this exodus of modern humans from Africa, departing populations carried only a subset of the diversity of their parental colonies. And this diversity can be cultural, phenotypic, behavioral, or linguistic. It's true for all of them. Now, migration was sequential, And as a result of it, there was lower level of diversity among ancestral population at greater migratory distance from Africa. And the idea is very simple. Humanity starts here in East Africa with a certain level of diversity. Population is departing, say, into the Fertile Crescent, and the departing population is not carrying the entire diversity that existed initially. Why is it the case? Simple statistical theory. The population in Africa is limited in size, the departing population is limited in size, and therefore this is not a representative sample of the population in Africa. And since migration is sequential, when this population ultimately continues into Europe, again, there is further decline in diversity, and as this population continues to Asia and ultimately into the America, diversity is further and further declining in this process. And the evidence are striking. If you look at migratory distance from Africa and the degree of diversity, and regardless of how you measure this diversity, different measures will generate very similar qualitative results. The further you are from Africa, the less diverse is the population. The most diverse population in the world are present in Africa, followed by Europe, Asia, Oceania, and Native Americans in the Americas. Now, why is it so important? It is important because diversity, and in particular cultural diversity, has conflicting effects on economic development. On the one hand, it has beneficial effects on creativity and innovations. It generates cross-fertilization of ideas and complementarities in the production process. But on the other hand, it has an adverse effect on social cohesiveness. It generates mistrust, disagreement about the desirable public goods, and consequently conflicts. And this implies that if there are positive and diminishing effects of diversity on innovations and positive and diminishing effects of diversity or homogeneity on social cohesiveness, then one should expect a ham-shaped relationship between diversity and development. And the evidence are striking and incredibly robust in this dimension. If you look at urbanization in the year 1500 and diversity, you see this ham-shaped relationship. Societies that are very diverse or very homogeneous are not performing as well as those societies that are having an intermediate level of diversity. If you focus on population density in 1500, the same ham-shaped relationship will be established. Income per capita in the past 200 years, the same relationship. And what is really striking is that in the process of development, since we move into a more and more demanding technological environment, societies that are more diverse having gradually the upper hand. So in the year 1500, optimal diversity was associated with the level of diversity in Japan. Now, we don't think about Japan or Korea or China as optimally diverse, but at the time, this was a sweet spot level of diversity that balanced between the positive effect of diversity on innovations and the positive effect of homogeneity on social cohesiveness. And cohesiveness was much more important than innovativeness. And that's the reason that these societies that are rather homogeneous were dominating the scene. But in today's world, in fact, what we see is that the peak of the hump is associated with the United States. Namely, a much more diverse society is dominating in this respect, namely, have the balancing effects of the effect of diversity on innovations in an era in which technology is evolving much more rapidly. And as I said, this is an unshakable result. If you look at ethnic groups across the globe, so we are not constrained by any elements of regions and country borders, etc., the same hump-shaped relationship will exist 10,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago, and 2,500 years ago. So overall, what we see in the course of human history is that the wheels of change, as I said earlier, are rotating and are propelling societies and are permitting the transition from stagnation to growth. But not all societies are enjoying the same rotation over time. Those societies that have institutions that are growth enhancing, those societies that are protecting property rights will have faster technological progress. And as a result of it, an earlier transition to the Neolithic revolution. Those societies that have growth enhancing cultural factors will have the proper population composition that will foster technological progress and the transition from stagnation to growth. Those societies that will have the geography that will be conducive to institutions and cultural factors that are growth enhancing, again, will move into sustained growth earlier. And those societies that are at intermediate level of migration from or their ancestral population, on average, at an intermediate level of migration from Africa, will be the ones that will have greater innovations, greater technological progress, and earlier transition. So again, the wheels of change are operating throughout human history everywhere. But the pace of the rotation is affected by institutions, by culture, by geography, and by population diversity. So does it imply that history is a fate? Does it imply that, in fact, humanity is doomed and everything was determined in the past? Not at all. In fact, the journey of humanity suggests to us that history is not a fate. In fact, by considering our history, we will be able to design our future. In what sense? Growth-enhancing policies ought to be country-specific, history-specific, and geographic-specific. The idea of one policy that fit all nations at once, that was promoted by the World Bank and the IMF for a long period of time, is contradictory to the insights of the journey of humanity. And let me give you two examples before concluding. Think about diversity. As I said before, some societies are very diverse, others are very homogeneous. How can we bring societies into the level of diversity that is most conducive for development? Education policies can do it. If you think about highly diverse society, in highly diverse society, we would like to mitigate the cost of diversity in terms of social non-cohesiveness. And therefore, the education curriculum will have to teach students how to be more tolerant, how to respect other ethnic groups, and consequently, this will reduce the cost of diversity. But if you take a homogeneous country, the policy will be precisely the opposite. There, in homogeneous society, we would like to foster pluralism. We would like to foster diversity that is absent otherwise. And this will be done by teaching students how to think critically, by teaching students how to challenge the status quo, by fostering cultural exchange, and as a result of it, pluralism in a place that pluralism is missing. Or in the context of growth-enhancing cultural traits, as I mentioned before, if you think about trust, or if you think about future-oriented mindset, again, in societies where future-oriented mindset is lacking due to the geographical endowment that did not train individuals to plan for the future, then again, we can educate children how to be more future-oriented. We can introduce them, for instance, for medical instruments in which the reward is coming with great delay and is providing a fantastic training for future-oriented mindset. More broadly, The Journey of Humanity, my book, suggests that the key to universal prosperity is flexible education, gender equality, tolerance, and diversity. So thank you very much. As I said, this was just a little taste of my book, The Journey of Humanity. You can read it at your desirable language. I promise that it is a fascinating read. It is written in a way that is unusual for economists. It is written in an attractive way, in a captivating way, and it can be read in 6 to 8 hours. It doesn't require days, weeks, or beyond. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Galor, for the wonderful overview of your great book. I actually read it myself over the last few months. So, but before I say more, let me turn it to Professor Wang, because he has to leave in about 10 minutes. Richard.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Professor Galor, for a very breathtaking and wide-ranging journey through man's history since the departure from Africa. I find many of your arguments very compelling. My job, however, is not to agree with you, I suppose, and to raise a little bit of different views. I have very little knowledge about history since we left agriculture as the primary mode. So I have no deep shall I say, I have no particular comments that I would like to address to that period. I find the hump-shaped diagrams regarding diversity and urbanization very useful, but my knowledge of genetic determinants of diversity intriguing, but I'm not. I would like to know a lot more about these measures before I will come to any conclusions. Because what are the factor of diversity impacting through economic, social, institutional impacts onto economic prosperity or urbanization? It's still a little bit. I find the connections not worked out, but I'm certainly very much taken by the consistency and stability of your results, right? Okay, so I am impressed by your empirical evidence, although I'm not able to connect up the processes in which they occur. I have two other comments more specifically on after we have come into modernity. I find one of the things that you omitted to give a major role in the process of modernity and the sequencing of modernization across the world is the role of energy. Certainly, for example, Kenneth Pomeranz has made his thesis based very much on the fact that coal was available in Britain and also in Europe as a important, perhaps in your framework, and a nice coincidental geological endowment, which coincided with the technological progress that took place in the 18th, 19th century to actually as an impact on that. But once you had industrialization, you have modernity, economic progress, and also along at that time, the emergence of nation states, it also impacted the technology of military operations with citizens' army, modern technology, nation-state rivalry, not to mention even on an international context, what has been described as imperialism. That probably had a considerable shift in terms of the evolution of modernization patterns, leading to much more complex consequences for wealth, inequality across the development process. Indeed, if you come to since technology has evolved further and coal is no longer the most important source of today's modernization, whereas oil is, and told is now more associated with climate concerns, etc. So I find the energy should take a more important description. I've not read your book. Perhaps you have described it in your book, but in your presentation and your YouTube, I don't detect them there. So it seems to me these accidental occasions trigger pathways in the course of modernization and international spread of that knowledge in different ways. So this is one of the things that I would look at. Another thing that I actually very much liked about your presentation, and that is your use of the term critical juncture as well as institutions. I make this remark because other fellow economists and political scientists, namely Ace McGlue and Robinson, has made a great deal to frame their interpretation of critical juncture and institutions in a very rigid way, imposing perhaps even ideological interpretations onto the use of these terms, whereas I appreciate much more the nuanced flexibility approach that you have, which allows institutions and critical juncture concepts to critical junctures, therefore, in your case, could be accidents of history, like hole in England, to some degree, other things that you've mentioned in your presentation that I won't go over, that I find enriches the narrative and allow a much more open-ended, if accidental process to how human progress in wealth and inequality might take place. And also your use of institutions is not as rigid as McGlue and Robinson's account, which becomes very rigid to a liberal democratic political ideology, which would be fully fit, in my view, because they use empirical evidence that is 500 years, right? Well, they cannot get much beyond that, I presume. So I find your use of these terminologies much more useful for us to study very wide-ranging experiences in the long course of history, even if it were 1,000 years. I find it much more useful. So let me therefore say I enjoy enormously your presentation. I have found some ideas that you used very helpful for my thinking about this process. And also I think there could be things that you could add to your narrative in subsequent work. Well, thank you very much, Professor Galor, for making this presentation.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Wang. So, Professor Galor, would you like to respond quickly?
Absolutely, I will be delighted. So thank you very much. That's very kind. I certainly appreciate your views about the book as a whole, and I appreciate your views about my take about institutions. I think that we share precisely the same view, in the sense that I don't want to view the world in a very ideological and predetermined and sort of dogmatic fashion. I would like to think about a holistic view of the world. The world evolved because of many different reasons. Some of them are institutions, but as I said earlier, culture, geography, human diversity are all very important. So let me try to convince you about the importance of diversity and why it is such an important fact. So as I said, just chronologically, this is very striking because it suggests to us that events that occurred as early as 60 to 90,000 years ago are still affecting economic development in a very persistent fashion. And if you read the book, and if you read some of my recent papers, where I try to quantify the effect of different elements in the process of development, I attribute about 16 to 25% of the variations in inequality today across nations to population diversity. An enormous amount of weight. This is not as large as geography. Geography will be in the magnitude of 30 to 40%, but it is significantly larger than the role of institutions, for instance, in understanding inequality across the globe today. So let me say a few things about diversity. So first, it should be very clear that this is a very broad notion of diversity, and it is predominantly diversity as we see it in society today. But the question, as you said, is how do we measure diversity? But when we think about diversity today, it is quite apparent that diversity will have conflicting effects on productivity. On the one hand, diversity is associated with cross-fertilization of ideas, and as a result of it, with innovations. But on the other hand, diversity is associated with social non-cohesiveness. And there is an entire literature that was originated in the study of Alessina and others that is showing, in fact, the negative effect of diversity, particularly cultural fractionalization, on the productivity of nations. So we have these two conflicting effects. And theoretically, the presence of these two conflicting effects suggests that, in fact, one should expect to see a hump-shaped relationship between diversity and development, namely that societies that are overly diverse will suffer from social non-cohesiveness in an extreme fashion. Societies that are overly homogeneous will not benefit sufficiently from innovations, and an intermediate level of diversity will be conducive for development. And now the question is, how do we measure diversity? So the measure of diversity that we suggest is basically based on migratory distance from Africa. And what is the idea? The idea is that during this migration process, as I said earlier, population that is departing from Africa is carrying only a subset of the traits that existed in the original population. And therefore, the further people migrated, the lower is the level of diversity. So what we do is, in fact, we ask ourselves, what is the migratory distance of each ancestral population from Africa? And based on that, we predict what will be the level of diversity of each indigenous population based on their migratory distance from Africa. But then contemporary populations, like a population in the United States, consist of a large number of ancestral population. Some people are originated in England, some in France, some in Scandinavia, some in Asia, some in Africa, some in Latin America. And therefore, we construct a measure that is the weighted average of the degree of diversity that existed in this ancestral population based on migratory distance from Africa, taking into account the pairwise distances between these populations. So we generate a very massive measure of diversity, okay, predicted diversity. And this predicted level of diversity, as I said, is enabling us to uncover this relationship between diversity and productivity. Now, if this measure would have been sort of nuisance, then naturally the results will be biased towards zero and we would not find any relationship. The fact that we find a relationship suggests that in fact we measure it properly, and not only that, if you go into the underlying papers behind this hypothesis, you will see that any element that I mentioned, any of the building blocks in the theory is very, very strongly supported by the evidence. So it's not only that it is immune to country fixed effects and regional fixed effects and placebo effects, etc. It is in fact associated with the building blocks that I mentioned. The adverse effect of diversity on social cohesiveness, adverse effect on trust, adverse effect on the disagreement about the desirable public goods, and the beneficial effects on innovativeness. So this is in the context of diversity.
Yeah.
Now, you asked about energy.
Professor Galor, Professor Wong has to leave now. So let's first thank Professor Wang for taking the time out of his busy schedule. So we can let him go now, and then Professor Galor can continue.
Absolutely. Okay, thank you very much for your comments. Yes.
So maybe,
Galor, for a wonderful presentation. I apologize I have to leave early. I wish you every success in the continuing presentations and discussions in this webinar.
Yeah, thank you. So Professor Galor, maybe while we are at this on the diversity point, let me bring up one comment from Clementina Cardoso in the Q&A box. She mentioned that the newly appointed Prime Minister of Sweden is investing in programs to encourage non-Swedish citizens to leave Sweden. How would you convince him that this is a mistake with grave economic and social consequences? Of course, related to this is this party congress going on in Beijing, calling for everyone to think and act very much like the party in a very homogeneous, monolithic way. So what do you think of that? Both what is happening in Sweden and in Beijing?
Yeah, so I'm sorry that there was an interruption in the sound. So you said that a minister in Sweden suggested to whom to leave Sweden? I couldn't hear this.
Oh yeah, she said the new prime minister in Sweden is investing in various programs to encourage non-Swedish citizens to leave Sweden. Yeah.
No, so I think this is very short-sighted policy. In fact, as I said, if I look at the process of development, and particularly in the past 500 years, it is quite apparent that the optimal level of diversity, the level of diversity that is conducive for development, has increased over time. And consequently, societies that are diverse, societies that will cherish diversity and maintain diversity, are the society that will prosper in the long run. And the reason is that diversity is providing cultural fluidity that allows you to navigate the stormy technological environment in which we operate. To think about it, I think it's very important to think about it in the context of why Europe is taking off first in the course of industrialization rather than China. If we think about China, the comparison between China and Europe, China naturally is dominating the world in the Middle Ages, technologically and otherwise. But nevertheless, it is Europe that is industrializing first. And how can we explain it in a very simple fashion in light of this discussion about diversity? So in the Middle Ages, China is very homogeneous for many different reasons. It is homogeneous because it is relatively far away from Africa in migratory sense. But in addition, it is homogeneous because the geography of China is such that we don't see land fragmentation. And as a result of it, China is able to homogenize the population and to have a cohesive population over time. Europe, on the other hand, is geographically fragmented. And consequently, we see greater cultural fluidity in Europe. This cultural fluidity is detrimental in the Middle Ages because in the Middle Ages, innovations are not so important as social cohesiveness. But as we get into the stage in which industrialization is looming on the horizon, it is this cultural fluidity that allows Europe to make the transition into the Enlightenment period, into the scientific revolution, and ultimately into the industrial revolution, whereas China is too homogeneous, too rigid to make this transition, and the transition is delayed for additional 2 centuries. So in this respect, if I think about it in the context of the wisdom of the current prime minister in Sweden, and I think that in fact, this is ignoring, in fact, an important lesson in human history, in the sense that Diversity is important. Diversity is precisely what permitted Europe ultimately to take off in the course of industrialization, and diversity will be needed for any society in order to meet the challenges that will come with further technological paradigm shift that will occur in the future.
Oh, so maybe your book should be quickly published in Swedish, so that the new prime minister can learn, in time to change his policy. Let me take two more questions from the Q&A box. So my colleague, David Palmer, says the following. So one could argue that the phase transition in one region relies on the phase transition not taking place elsewhere. For example, first, the opium production in highland Southeast Asia, which was stimulated and coordinated by French and British companies with higher human capital, required such large families to engage in production that ethnic groups expanded their numbers through adoption. The post-Malthusian European trading firms relied on the labor of Malthusian societies. Secondly, nowadays, post-Malthusian societies with stable or even collapsing demographics rely on the younger and cheaper labor of societies that still have lingering Malthusian dynamics. How does your theory explain these types of situation?
Right. So my theory explains very, very, very well, and let me try to explain how. So I have two elements in the theory. The first one is basically a theory how the world is operating as a whole. And as I said, in the first part of the theory, I explained what are the wheels of change that are rotating anywhere on planet Earth, but potentially in differential pace. And I suggest that these wheels of change are ultimately generating technological acceleration that brings about demand for human capital, a demographic transition, and a transition to sustained economic growth. But when we think about an interdependent world, and we think about different forces that are operating in different regions, as I argued, the rotations of the wheels of change are going to be different in different places across the globe. In particular, in an interdependent world, particularly if colonial powers are involved and there is colonial relationship between the colonizers and those that are being colonized, then, in fact, the transition from stagnation to growth can be expedited in some societies, and the transition from stagnation to growth can be slowed in other societies. So, for instance, if you look at my paper with Mountford in the Review of Economic Studies 2008, I basically explore the impact of trade relationship that is established between societies that are under colonial domination and their effect on the transition from stagnation to growth. And what I basically illustrate, particularly looking at the case of India and England, is that the trade relationship between India and England is generating gains from trade for the two societies, but nevertheless is expediting the transition from stagnation to growth of England, but delaying the transition of India by about 2 centuries by basically depressing the demand for human capital formation, by increasing fertility, and by trapping India into a longer period than necessary in the Malthusian trap. So in fact, one can integrate interdependence into the basic theory. And as I said, much of the second part of the book is dealing precisely with this relationship and the transition from stagnation to growth in an interdependent world.
Okay, so yeah, there are many other questions and comments in the Q&A box, so we cannot address all of them because of we're already beyond schedule. Let me take one short question from Fali Huang. Is there any distinct role of religions?
So religion is very important in the course of human history for many different reasons. So when we think about religion, I would like to classify it in the context of my discussion about culture. That's certainly a certain cultural element. And naturally, when we think about religious forces, they may bring about certain cultural, what I defined before as cultural mutation. We talked about it in the context of Judaism and emergence of education. We refer to this in the context of the Protestant Reformation and the emergence of entrepreneurial spirit and education. So education, religion can be a force that can expedite the transition from stagnation to growth by promoting accidentally growth-enhancing traits. But at the same time, as I elaborate in the book, religion can be a force that suppresses progress. If religion is being threatened by, say, the development of the printing press, and as a result of it, there is an attempt to suppress this development, as was the case in Islam, then this will delay ultimately human capital formation, education, and the transition from stagnation to growth. So religion is an important force, but I would classify it in the context of the importance of cultural factors, broadly speaking.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Galor, and also thanks to everyone who are still not checking out yet. Sorry that we are already 6 minutes beyond the scheduled time. So let's just stop here. So we are going to forward all of your questions and comments to Professor Galor, and then if he has time, we'll encourage him to respond to your questions and so on. So this is it for today's webinar. And let me also say that in 1 week, a week from today, we're going to have Professor Yuhua Wang from the Harvard University's Kennedy School. He's going to speak on the rise and fall of imperial China. So that is Thursday, October 27th. So you're all welcome to sign in. So in the meantime, so again, thanks to Professor Galor and to all of you for taking part in today's webinar. Okay, so see you all in 1 week. Thank you.